All right, so now we're going to start jumping into like some teaching strategies. And really, what I want you to understand is that this class is truly the practical application of what you've already learned. So, we're going to take some of the things you learned in your first curriculum course with Professor Weiss, and then we're going to add it with what you've already learned about applied behavior analysis. And this is going to help you to learn how you can implement those things, curriculum, and then the things you already know about applied behavior analysis in your own classroom. And so, as you're thinking about your own classroom, I want you to stop and think about what do you love about teaching? Why have you decided to become a special education teacher, specifically a special education teacher for students with complex support needs? And so, first, we're going to start. I'm going to share some reasons that teachers that I found online love teaching. And then I'm going to give you a second to think about what you love about teaching. So Kennedy and Atkins said, I love when I collect work at the beginning of the year and then compare it at the end of the year. Growth makes me so happy, even the slightest. Think about how you feel when you know that you've taught your students something and that they've grown, that they've learned a new skill or a new behavior to help them in life. Another teacher said, realizing down the line that you were the one that helped make a difference in their life. And I don't want you to ever underestimate the difference that you will make in the lives of children, children who will later become adults, and how you impact not only their education now, but their life down the road. Sarah said, I love how my kindergartners are so excited to learn and try new things each day. Their curiosity and love for the world make my job amazing. And so I want you to think about how when you nurture that curiosity and that love for the world, that your job becomes amazing. Not only it does the children's experience, educational experience become amazing, but it makes your job amazing and enjoyable. Oh, let's look at another one. Avery, who's a mom and a teacher, said, I teach high school, and the best thing is seeing what they do after they graduate and just the relationships you form with them. So I want you, as you think about what you love about teaching, I also want you to think about the impact you have on the lives of individuals. And so not only, let's say you're teaching kindergarten like Sarah is, you not only impact their life as kindergartners, but you impact what you do with them as kindergartners impacts their life after they graduate and once they're in that a world of adulthood, right? And so one of the things that we really need to make sure that we're doing is that we are providing quality instruction for our students. Because if we are using evidence-based practices and research-based practices with our students, think about the impact and the ultimate outcome they will have once they graduate. So, as we're thinking about instruction, let's go ahead and dive into systematic instruction. And I want to just point out that how important this is because systematic instruction is one of the most powerful things you can do for your students is to use systematic instruction. And so here I just want to emphasize systematic instruction, systematic instruction, systematic instruction. It is that important. And so we're going to start by talking about what you know. And you all may be familiar with this. This is a graphic organizer that you can use in your class. It's called a KWL chart. Sometimes you'll see it written as a KWHL chart. And you start by talking about what the students know, what they want to know, and then later on what they've learned. So let's start by talking about what you might already know about systematic instruction. So I want you to get out your Word document that you've been making your notes on. And again, these are just notes. They don't have to be super in depth. I just want to make sure that you're thinking and that you're engaging with the content because we're using videos. So I want you to share what you currently know about systematic instruction, however much or as little as that is. So go ahead and stop the video, and I want you just to do a real quick write and write as much as you possibly can. Now give yourself maybe like a minute or so, as much as you possibly can about what you know about systematic instruction. Stop the video now. All right. So, building on what you already know, hopefully you know something. So go ahead and building on that. What is systematic instruction? Well, in 2015, Snell defined systematic instruction as a repeatable, predictable, organized process that reflects currently accepted best practices using performance data to make educated modifications to instructions. Well, again, what does that mean? What does that really mean? Well, and so what that really means is that you are systematically setting up your instruction and you're modifying it as needed based on data. So making data-based decisions. So, systematic instruction, again, is a very structured teaching approach, and it has been used for many, 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 many years with students with complex support needs, used successfully with students with complex support needs. And so, it really has a few major components, and we're going to dive more deeply into these, but I'm going to share it with you so you can see a little bit of it as a whole. So, some of its major components include that there you clearly define what students are expected to learn. And so this is often done through measurable behavioral goals. And so, when you're writing your IEP goals, your IEP objectives, you want to make sure that they're observable and they're measurable. So when you're using systematic instruction, your goals, whether that's your IEP goals, your instructional goals, need to be clearly defined so that everyone understands what the expectation for learning is. Not only that, you break down complex tasks into smaller, manageable steps. And this is why those task analyses are so important because it takes something that might be very difficult for a student to learn as a whole and breaks it down into steps that are teachable and that are manageable and that are easier for students to acquire and become independent with. Not only that, you're going to use things like prompts, you're going to use reinforcement and error correction in order to facilitate our students' learning. Because we know that initially we often have to provide that support and then we fade it as our students become more proficient with their skills. And then finally, you are going to collect and record your data to monitor students' learning and their progress. Because again, everything we do is based on data. And if there's no data, it didn't happen. So you're going to collect that data, you're going to review and analyze that data, and then make data-based decisions based on that analysis. And these are the major components of systematic instruction. So I want you to stop again. This is a time for you to stop, and I want you to think for a moment and then write in your document that you're going to submit to Canvas. What might be a few benefits of using systematic instruction? And I will go ahead and I'll kind of roll this back so that you can stop on this screen and think about what might the benefits be. Again, you can just do quick little bullet points. It doesn't have to be something that you spend, 10 minutes writing. These are quick writes as you're doing your video. All right, go ahead and stop it now and make a list of what you can identify as the benefits of systematic instruction. All right, now that you've identified some of the benefits, let me share some with you that I'm aware of. One of the benefits of systematic instruction is it increases the pace of your lessons. And I'm sure that you recall from your foundations class is that when you can keep a brisk pace in your lesson, then students are more engaged and that you maintain their attention at higher levels. So that's a benefit of systematic instructions is that it helps keep students engaged. It also helps you cover content more quickly. So it makes your teaching more efficient. Not only that, when you use systematic instruction and you have a clear understanding and proficiency in implementing instructional strategies that are found in systematic instruction, it increases your self-efficacy. I can tell you when I learned to use constant time delay, my belief in my teaching strategies increased. When I became proficient in using the system of least prompts, my belief in myself as a teacher and my ability to implement effective and efficient instruction increased. Students acquire skills much more quickly when you use systematic instruction, and we know we have a limited amount of time with students. We need to make the most of every minute we have. Systematic instruction results in better student outcomes, and that's what we're here for, right? That's our ultimate goal, is to have positive student outcomes. It makes your teaching so much easier. I can say right now, if I walked into a classroom and somebody said, teach these sight words, I'm going to use constant time delay. I automatically know how I'm going to do it. I don't have to think deeply about the instruction because it's an instructional strategy, systematic instruction that I'm now proficient with. And I know it's an evidence-based practice that I can use across many different skills. I know if I'm going to teach a student to put on a jacket, that I'm going to use either the system of least prompts or most to least prompting. So those are all things that fall under systematic instruction. Makes your teaching so much easier, not only for you, but for, again, like your paraprofessionals. And you can teach it also to peer mentors. We have had studies where we've been very successful in implementing, for example, writing instruction with peers, where we had fifth grade students who are using systematic instruction and they were instructing their peers on how to write sentences. So those are just a few of the benefits, in addition to the ones that I'm sure that you added in your list. And when I think about it, this is the stuff I love. That's what that heart is. As a teacher, and again, I was a teacher for 32 years, this is what makes your job easy. This is what makes your students acquire skills and become proficient and independent with the skills you're teaching them. And it is just so powerful. So again, this is stuff that I love. So, systematic instruction is based in applied behavior analysis. So, what I'm getting ready to go over here should be stuff that you are aware of, because you should have just recently had an applied behavior analysis class. And so, when we have an instructional trial, and an instructional trial is when you're teaching, so I'm teaching this right now. There are typically, and there are more than this, but for the purpose of this course, there are three components that you're looking at. You're looking at an antecedent, and that is sometimes called a stimulus. And so the antecedent is what happens before the behavior. And I'll show you some examples of this in just a minute. So you have the antecedent, which is what occurs before the behavior. Then you have the behavior, which could also be called the response. And then after the behavior, once the student engages in a behavior, you have some kind of consequence. And so you often hear this called the ABCs, but you might also hear it called stimulus, response, and consequence. And so an example of this would be an antecedent would be a task direction, you telling a child what is the expectation is. The behavior might be, for example, the student responding correctly to what your directions were. And then the consequence could be something like a high five, or they get a token for their token chart. And so I'm going to show this a little bit more in detail so you have a clear understanding. But again, I do believe this is review from your ABA course. So here are some examples of instructional trials. And again, we're going to start with the antecedent, go to the behavior, and then the consequence. So for example, the bell rings, the student lines up, and then the student gets to go to recess. So that's the consequence for them lining up when they have the antecedent or the stimulus of the bell. Here's another example. We could call this again an antecedent or a stimulus. The paraprofessional holds up a number and says, "What number?" The student responds, 12. And then the paraprofessional says, "Yes, 12. That's the number 12. You got it." And so that's your reinforcement. That's positive reinforcement, right? And then here's another example. The teacher says, "Get your math book." The behavior is the student falls to the floor and refuses to move. And then the consequence is that the teacher says, "Then just lie there." And as a result, the consequence is the student gets to avoid math work, which again can be positively reinforcing. If I fall to the floor and I don't have to do my work, that positively reinforces that behavior. So again, those are the antecedent, behavior, and consequences, or a stimulus, response, and consequence. So let's continue to look at that a little bit more in depth. But before we do that, what I want you to do is again, stop the video for a second and make sure you're labeling things so you can just say examples of instructional trials. And I want you just to create a list, and you don't have to do a ton of them. Take, however many you feel comfortable with, more than two. So if we can maybe do two, let's say 2 to 3 instructional trials as a minimum. I want you to complete the chart below with examples of instructional trials. So I want to see an antecedent, a behavior, and then a consequence. All right, go ahead and stop the video and then come back when you're done. All right, so I hope you came up with some good instructional trials. I look forward to being in class and hearing about those. So, the next thing we want to talk about is a response interval. So, what is a response interval? Again, hopefully, this is a refresher from your ABA course. Well, the response interval is what happens right here. So, it's what's happening between the antecedent and the behavior, or the stimulus and the response. And really, what that is, what a response interval is a set amount of time, for example, 5 seconds, and it follows the presentation of the stimulus in which the student can perform a task. So I have now given you a stimulus, the bell rings, and then you have 5 seconds, that's your response interval, in order to line up at the door for recess. And so it's the time between the task direction or the cue and the behavior or response, or it could be between two behaviors, for example, in a task analysis. So it might be that I'm teaching you to brush your teeth, and so I start by giving you the task direction, brush your teeth, and then I wait 5 seconds. That's your response interval to give you the opportunity to respond independently. You reach for your toothbrush. That's a behavior. Now I'm going to give you a response interval again, 5 seconds, in order for you to get your toothpaste. Now, if you don't in between those, we'll talk about this later, there's prompting that I would give, but that response interval is either the time between the task direction and the student's behavior or response, or it could come between two behaviors, such as 2 steps in a task analysis. And so when you have an instructional trial, when you're teaching, these are the components that are involved. Now, I want to stop and tell you this is really important. So you need to know these because later on, when you're doing lessons, I'm going to be looking for all 4 of these components, okay? So the first thing you do is an intentional cue. That's like an attention getter. And we'll look at what some of those might be. I'll go ahead and actually do those now. So those may be something like an intentional cue might be eyes on me. It might be something like you're clapping a pattern. It could be something, you hear these a lot nowadays, where a teacher says red and then the student says robin. It could be something like if you're working with younger children, like the cleanup song, clean up, everybody, everywhere. And that is your attentional cue. Everybody knows now it's time to start cleaning. Or it might be something like you set a timer, and that's your attentional cue. All right, everybody, look, we've got 5 minutes. So you start your instructional trial for teaching with an attentional cue. And then you have it might be called, sometimes it's called an instructional cue or a task direction. I often call it a task direction, but know that those two words are those two terms are interchangeable. An instructional cue or a task direction. Then you have a response, that's the student's behavior, followed by a consequence. So again, the components of an instructional trial are an intentional cue, an instructional cue or a task direction, a response, which is the behavior, and then a consequence. But now, I want to make sure that you're aware. Some people think of consequence and they think it's a punishment, and that is absolutely not what a consequence is in the context of education or an instructional trial. That is not at all what it is. And so, really, with a consequence, there are 2 different types of consequences that a student might receive. One of them might be reinforcement for correct responses, so positive reinforcement. And so I hope in your ABA course you learn that positive reinforcement increases the likelihood of correct responses in the in the future, or positive reinforcement increases the likelihood of the reoccurrence of a behavior in the future. And so it's really important that when we are using positive reinforcement, that we use students' preferred reinforcers. And so I would encourage you all to periodically do preference assessments with your students to find out what are their preferred type of reinforcement. Do they like high fives? Do they like a fist bump? Do they want to do a celebratory dance? Are they a student that you need to use some type of a token economy with? Because what we want to remember is that not everyone likes praise. In fact, there are cultures that it will make a student very uncomfortable for you to praise them or point them out in front of their peers. And so that's one reason it's really important to know our students, to know their families and their cultures, and to do preference assessments. And so when we have the reinforcement, we can have behavior specific reinforcement. So something like, I like the way you're raising your hand. That's very behavior specific. I'm uh, focusing on raising the hand. That might be something we've had on your IEP. It could be something that's very general. So I'm teaching you, I'm in baseline, and so I'm collecting data. I don't want to give you any hints of how you're doing correct or getting responses correct or incorrect or lead you to any kind of response. So I might give you general positive reinforcement. Oh, I really like the way you walked over when I called your name. Or you might embed non-target information as part of your positive reinforcement. And we'll look at examples of that in a minute. So that positive reinforcement could be like high fives. It could be earned free time. My students love that, was earned free time. You might write a positive note home or give them time to engage with a preferred activity or item. So, a second type of consequence is corrective feedback. And oftentimes you're going to hear me refer to that as error correction. And so it's corrective feedback for incorrect responses or error correction. And so I just want to make sure that we all know that we never, ever, ever leave students with incorrect responses unless we're like in baseline. If we're in baseline, I'm not going to correct you, right? Because I want to see where your performance is now. But when we're teaching students and we're not in baseline, we don't want to leave them with incorrect responses. And we also don't want to reinforce incorrect responses. I have seen this so many times. So, for example, I want a student to point to the word dog, and instead they point to cat. And when they point to cat, someone might say, "No, that's not dog, that's cat. You pointed to the word cat. I told you to point to dog, that's cat." What did you just reinforce? Did you reinforce dog or did you reinforce cat? You said cat so many times that you were reinforcing, or I was reinforcing, an incorrect response. And so later in the next couple of weeks, we're going to learn about error correction. But again, when we're talking about consequences, we are not talking about punishment. We're either talking about reinforcement for positive or for correct responses, or we're talking about corrective feedback for incorrect responses, also known as error correction. And so a minute ago, I talked about non-targeted information in feedback. And so I want to give you some examples of what that might be, because we can reinforce students for correct responses and then also add non-targeted information, which can be part of our teaching strategy. And here's an example if I were teaching reading or phonics. So the target is what we want the student to do is to identify the letter M. And so when the student gets it correct, now listen, I'm going to embed some non-targeted information. And I might say something like, "You got it, that's M. M says like in milk. Milk is a dairy product that comes from cows." And so you can see that while I wanted them to identify the letter M, I embedded the sound. M makes the sound like in milk. So then I focused on the beginning sound of a word, and then I added just some general knowledge that milk is a dairy product that comes from cows. So all of those things are non-targeted information. Let's look at a couple more examples. In math, the target is that the student will answer 5 plus 3 equals 8. And so the student gets it right. And I might say, yes, 5 plus 3 equals 8. 8 is an even number, which means it can be divided into two equal groups. So even though we're working on addition, I added in there information, non-targeted information about even numbers. And now there's a behavioral one we'll look at. So what the student is doing is the student is answering comprehension questions. That's what our focus is. The student gets the answer correct, and I say, "You're right. He did find a ticket to the chocolate factory. I love the way you raised your hand and waited for me to call on you." So you can see that while I'm working on, in this case, it would be literacy, right? Literacy and comprehension, I embedded some behavioral, non-targeted information on raising your hand and waiting to be called on. So again, just examples of non-targeted information that you can embed in feedback. So let's look at what that might look like. So we can also embed non-targeted information. The student can learn non-targeted information through observational learning. And that is exactly what it sounds like. You are observing, the student is observing learning. And we're going to see examples of that in just a second. So when you're teaching in a group instructional arrangement, students have the opportunity to observe what other students are taught. They are able to observe other students' correct responses when a student gets it correct, and they're able to observe students' errors correction, other students' error correction. So when this student gets it incorrect, I can see the teacher engage in error correction, and I'm learning through observation, observing that error correction. I'm learning through observation. So let's watch this. This student is learning to write a sentence using an iPad app called Go Talk Now. And I want you to watch this student, specifically how he is observing and learning as the other student is working.
Thomas, I want you to use the same thing about these words. Sorry about it. That's not like studying. Studying. Oh. That's a gun new word. Studying. About.
All right, we'll stop it right there. So you can see that while this student is learning and the teacher is working directly with him, the other student is observing and he's learning as well. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure if you heard or not, but when the student here made a mistake, the other student said, "That's not right." So he is engaging in his own learning as a result of observing his peer. All right, let's move forward with that. So there are two types of systematic instruction. And again, I want you to think about this and stop for a second and do just a quick write, maybe again, a minute on each of them max. And write, what do you know about the following? So what do you know about stimulus prompts? And then what do you know about response prompting? Again, write as much or as little as you can. And if you're like, "I'm lost on this," just write what you think it might be. And we're going to continue to talk about this in class, okay? So again, stop the video and write what you know about stimulus prompts and what you know about response prompting, and then come back. All right. So when we're talking about the two types of systematic instruction, we want to go back and think about what we already know from our ABA. So when we're looking at something like an instructional trial, we have a stimulus and a prompt can go with that. So a stimulus and a prompt. So it might be that when I'm teaching, I'm showing you the color red and I'm also pointing to it. This is the color red. Then you're going to have a response, and that's the student's behavior, the response you want the student to engage in, and then the consequence. So let's look at what that might look like when it comes to stimulus prompting. So when we have stimulus prompting, I'm going to give you the definition by Collins, and then I'm going to give it to you in kind of like layman's terms. So Collins said that that stimulus prompting is assistance, and that could be through a picture, a verbal statement, something like a color cue. So assistance that is inserted in the antecedent to the instructional trial before a student is asked to respond, and increases the likelihood that the learner will make a correct response. Okay, what does that mean? Well, really, it's just some kind of support. And again, that could be a picture, it could be a verbal statement, it could be a color cue, and you're adding it to some kind of material, and we'll see examples of that in just a second, before instruction, before the task begins. And the reason you're adding this is to increase the likelihood that the student will correctly respond. So the big key to stimulus prompting is it's added before instruction or the task begins. And so we'll see some examples of that. So these are some examples of some stimulus prompts. And for homework, you have a stimulus prompt project, so pay close attention here, okay? So here are some examples of stimulus prompts. One is highlighting. That's a stimulus prompt, and that's something you're going to do before you begin instruction so that the student's attention is drawn directly to the area or the words or the content that you've highlighted. Another stimulus prompt might be positioning. So if I want the student to identify the red light bulb, I have made it very obvious by putting in that stimulus prompt of moving it closer to the student. It stands out because it is not aligned. I have used positioning in that stimulus. Another one is contrast. And you can see the very clear difference here as far as the contrast between the lemons that are yellow and the one lemon that is pink. Another one might be fading. So if I'm teaching the word red, perhaps initially it's going to be all red, and that is my stimulus clue that, or stimulus prompt that I put in before I started teaching you, as I wrote it in red, and then I slowly fade out the color red until it's just written in our typical black. It's what we typically write things in. Or it could be a verbal stimulus prompt. And that might be something like Matt. Listen, Matt. Now, before I ever ask you anything, before I give you any kind of instruction, I am putting that verbal stimulus prompt in there of elongating the sound. And again, these were all done before instruction or the task begins, before I actually gave you the task direction. And you can see how all of these stimuli would support a student in making a correct response. So what might this actually look like? So let's take a look at it and see. It might look like the task direction being touch red. And then when the student does touch red, so this is the stimulus with the prompt. The prompt is the red, the positioning. The behavior is the student touching red. And then the consequence is they receive a high five. So again, the task direction is touch red. The student touches red and they get a high five. The next one, there's some pros and cons to stimulus prompts. So let's talk about those quickly. Well, some of the pros are it promotes our errorless learning, and that's what we want. We really are focused on errorless learning because we don't want students to make errors if at all possible. It reduces the need for instructor intervention because we have a stimulus there that's supporting our student. It can be engaging for students. It can be engaging for students to, let's say, challenge themselves as you're fading off, if we're doing red, or it's engaging when they're looking for the stimulus or the object or context that you have that's in contrast. It's super easy to implement. You can integrate it into your material so it's not like something that's cumbersome that you have to bring into your lesson. And another great thing is that it supports discrimination learning, which discrimination is a task that we have to very explicitly teach many of our students with complex support needs. So what they end up learning is to discriminate between or differentiate between different stimuli that are similar from one another, such as the light bulbs. They're similar to one another, but they're able to differentiate because of the positioning. But there are also some cons to it. It requires you to systematically fade. We are not always going to highlight because if we always highlight, you begin to rely on the highlighting. We're not always going to do positioning because when it comes to positioning, how am I going to know when you have mastered that and you can identify, let's say, red again independently if I'm always positioning it so that it's the light bulb that stands out? It may not generalize easily. We've got to think about generalization with all of our students. And it can also be much less effective for abstract skills, such as things like matching or labeling, identifying. Excuse me, it's best for discrete skills such as matching, identifying, and labeling. So if you're doing something like long division, that might not be as helpful, again, because that's more abstract. It can also be time consuming to design because you have to set up all of those stimulus prompts before you begin instruction. And then there is also the risk of prompt overuse or students becoming prompt dependent. And I very loosely say becoming prompt dependent because they become prompt dependent because we don't fade the prompts quickly enough. Anytime a student is dependent on prompts, it is our fault because we did not fade those prompts when we should have. And we don't want students to become prompt dependent, and we don't want to become dependent on using things like stimulus prompts. We have to fade those systematically and as quickly as possible. So what I want you to do right now is to stop the video, and I want you just to quickly write a definition of what a stimulus prompt is. I want you to give one example of how you would use a stimulus prompt in your classroom, and then I want you to write what is the purpose of stimulus prompting. So I'm going to leave the PowerPoint on this page so that when you stop it, you can see what the three questions are. And again, I do ask that you add the questions or something to indicate what you're responding to. So go ahead and stop the video now and answer those questions. All right. I just want to do a quick check-in, do a check-in with yourself and see how do you think you're doing. Are you like, yeah, I got this. This is cool. Are you like, yeah, I need a little more help on it. I'm going to have to work on it a little bit more. Or are you like, I'm completely lost? I'm going to do these self-checks. I do them throughout the PowerPoints. And if I do a self-check and there's something that you're not clear on, when we're doing the videos, I highly encourage you to make a note somewhere so that when we get to class, you know to ask a question about that. And so if you have any questions, I just encourage you to ask them. I welcome all questions. And as everybody says, if you have a question, you can guarantee someone else has that same question, okay? All right, so now let's keep moving on. We're going to go back to the two different types of systematic instruction, except for this time we're going to talk about response prompting. And so giving you the Collins definition again, it's assistance, and that could be something like a verbal prompt, a gestural prompt, a model, or some kind of physical prompt from the instructor that is inserted into an instructional trial after presenting the antecedent or stimulus and increases the likelihood the learner will make a correct response. All right, that's a mouthful again. So what does that mean in layman's terms, or how can we more easily understand that? So again, it's just some type of support. And I think that you've learned about the prompting hierarchy, so that's an easy one to look at. So it could be a verbal prompt, a gestural prompt, a model, or a physical prompt that the teacher provides, and it is provided after the instructional cue or the task direction, but before the student responds. And so if we go back and we think about our ABC, it is between the antecedent and the behavior. It's between it, not before. Stimulus response prompt, you do before. A response prompting, it's between the task direction and the students responding. Okay. But what a response prompting does is it increases the likelihood that the student will correctly respond. And again, our goal is errorless learning. And that's what response prompting does is it leads to errorless learning when used correctly. And so let's see what that might look like. And so in this case, we're going to be using a model prompt. So when you're looking for the prompt, it's going to be a point, okay? So here I might say, touch red, and then I reach over and I point to red because that's what my controlling prompt is. So touch red, and it's paired with the prompt. Then the student touches red and I give them a high five. So what you see here is it happens in conjunction with or right after your task direction. They can happen together, or one might happen right after one another, but it's before the student's behavior, okay? But there is an exception. We're in special ed. There is an exception to everything. And the exception is with a response prompting strategy called the system of least prompts, or sometimes it's called least to most prompting. And with the system of least prompts, you begin with the opportunity for a student to respond independently. So I'm going to give you the task direction, and then there's going to be a response interval in which I allow you the opportunity, or I give you the opportunity to respond independently. And it's only if the student doesn't respond or responds incorrectly that I then begin to use the prompting hierarchy. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But again, that should have been something you've learned in your ABA course. So with that, again, I'm going to give you the student the opportunity to respond independently, and only if they don't respond or they respond incorrectly, then I then begin using the prompting hierarchy, starting with the least intrusive prompt and then moving to a more intrusive prompt as needed. So in every other case, you're going to give a prompt um, right after the antecedent or between the antecedent and the behavior, or sometimes it might be paired with the antecedent. So with response prompting, and we're going to learn about specific response prompting strategies, there's more than 50 years of research behind response prompting. It's an evidence-based practice or a research practice for all disabilities, all ages, all types of skills, all settings, all types of instructors. And it's also recognized as a high leverage practice. So we want to make sure that we think about the fact that we want to be using these research-based, evidence-based, and evidence-based practices as well as high leverage practices. And so when we're looking at an evidence-based practices, it's based on research. That research had to be of really high quality. It had to provide proof through repeated studies that the strategy in this example worked and was effective, and the research has to be carried out in a very rigorous manner. That's how we end up with an evidence-based practice. And so what I want you to do now, instead of turning and talk, stop the video, and then I want you to answer the same three questions about response prompting. What is response prompting? When does response prompting occur? And what is the purpose of response prompting? So go ahead and stop the video and then come back and we'll keep going. All right, everybody, welcome back. So let's do a quick check-in. How are you feeling about systematic instruction? And again, this is just a brief introduction. So do a check-in for yourself, or you're like, I'm good, I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm starting to get it, but I need a little bit more time with it, or I am completely lost. I have no idea what we're talking about. So again, I want you to stop, and if needed, to make a note somewhere that you have a question. And then when we come back together for class, I want you to share your question with us so I can make sure that you're really clear on response prompting. All right? All right, thanks a lot. And I'm going to stop this video now, and we will get ready for our next one. Thanks a lot, everybody.